People who grew up with wealth. What was your privileged wake-up call? Story 1. When I was confused about people on Maury complaining their spouse was at the club, and I couldn't figure out what type of country club would let people like that through the front security gate. Story 2. At this point I already knew I was very well off, but after I had gotten laid off for the first time a few years ago, I took a break for about a month before diving into a job search. I was at the self-checkout at the grocery store next to a woman paying with food stamps. I had recently gotten $100,000 from my grandmother's inheritance and it hit me I'm unemployed, not even trying to find a job, and I just got a boatload of money because somebody else died, and she's the one people think is the freeloader. Story 3. My parents are wealthy, but I grew up in a place where many of my peers' parents were super duper crazy wealthy, so I had a really skewed understanding of wealth. It was really eye-opening for me when I went to college. I didn't have to take out student loans, my parents were able to just pay for it, but I had friends who even with financial aid had to work their butts off year-round to cover the cost of school. I realized pretty quickly just how privileged I was and that I did in fact grow up with wealth. Story 4. When I was a kid my best friend came to our house for the first time. He kept saying wow, he was really impressed that we had 2 TVs. It embarrassed me enough that I didn't tell him we had 4. Story 5. Becoming an adult and realizing that I have extremely good role models as parents, because when they have disagreements they talk them out and I have never ever heard them argue or badmouth each other. I also realized that as a kid my parents got me mental health help that I needed even though it was expensive and continue that care for as long as I have needed it. A third one that doesn't seem like much but has had a huge impact was being taught financial literacy from a young age, to budget my money and only buy the things I really want. Story 6. I have an uncle who has money. I was a wild madman of a kid, had a lot of psychological stuff going on and had lots of legal issues from the time I was really young. From 11 onwards, I spent about 10 years going in and out of juvies and jails and had a bunch of court cases. Every time I was in court, I had a private lawyer. And these lawyers would fight for me. You could not violate my rights because my lawyer would make a scene about it. You could not attempt to intimidate me into a plea deal, regardless of whether I even did something or if it was one of the cases where I was falsely accused, because my lawyers would fight right back and challenge the prosecutor to take it to trial, and then the prosecutor would generally give up because they knew that they couldn't actually prove that particular allegation. The reason that I didn't end up in prison despite my various attempts to, is because of the lawyers. My uncle also paid a lot of money to get me into treatment programs, rehab, put me into a really good school, got me counselors, got me everything I needed, and he saved my life, and I turned out to be just a normal, chill person by my early 20s. I met so many people in the system who will never have any of that, people who need help and who will never receive it. The system does nothing in terms of root causes of criminality, it does nothing to prevent recidivism, it does nothing. Court is nothing but a chess game on a conveyor belt and people get screwed over every day. I'd also like to point out that I'm not disparaging public defenders. There are many passionate public defenders who do excellent work, but their caseloads are too big. They cannot allocate endless time to a person's case because they don't have the time. Public defense needs way more funding than it gets. Story 7. Every summer, I went to 8 weeks of overnight camp, or some other cool summer program 30-day bus tour across western US, 3 weeks in Australia. I had no idea what those cost at the time. Story 8. I was gonna say I realized how privileged I was when I spent a summer with my great-grandmother in a small village in rural Hungary. No indoor running water, the only phone was at the church, and everyone came out to touch the rental car we drove there in. This was in the late 1980s. But after reading some of the comments on here, I feel poor again. Story 9. I don't really come from wealth, just solidly upper middle class, but as part of my job I do home visits, and have many clients who are poor. When I first started my career in my 20s, I was shocked to discover there were people in the US who lived in homes with no indoor plumbing or electricity, with dirt floors, or had outdoor kitchens not like a barbecue setup, like there was no kitchen inside where they lived, so they had to cook on an oil drum outside. I had no idea. Story 10. I did not grow up wealthy. We were a single-income household and my dad made like $30K most of my childhood 1990s. That's decent in the 90s, but there were several of us kids. However, my grandparents are very wealthy, my dad worked for them, but they just didn't pay him well. I work in finance, and I've seen their old pay stubs, so I know. My grandfather was just an old anyways, good man, but old-fashioned and wouldn't pay for anyways. It dawned on me how wealthy my family was when I started looking for a real job about 15 years ago. I had worked multiple jobs because my parents were like, if you want a phone and car, etc., you are on your own. I was talking to my pops about getting my finance degree. A week later, one of the wealthiest men in the area that owns several businesses called me. He's like, your pops said you're studying finance, we're hiring an XX company, send your sum to my secretary. Then my pops called and said, hey, I heard you got a job at XX. I hadn't even sent their sum. I didn't know my pops knew him. After that, I thought about many little occurrences over my life. Although I was never given money directly from my parents or grandparents, they opened doors for me. I talked to my dad about it a couple years ago. He said I've recently inherited more money than he'll ever need. Your pops always told me to live life like he'll never inherit a penny, and I encourage you to act the same. Many folks are given money and have no skills to manage it. We wanted to give you the skills in case you are given money. I personally was not wealthy, but I have definitely been privileged. Story 11. My parents loved to travel. By the time I was 16 I had been to every continent aside from Antarctica. I didn't realize that this was privileged behavior until I went to uni and most of the guys I met had never left the country. In fact, I grew up thinking I was less privileged because everyone at my school was just obscenely rich. Like all their stuff was high-end designer stuff while I was in Converse. Story 12 answering for my privileged 14-year-old daughter, we are most definitely not wealthy. Just okay day to day when she arrogantly corrected a friend that Spotify doesn't have ads. Story 13 in 9th grade I unhappily attended a fancy private school. When we'd go on a field trip through the most expensive old money neighborhood in town, everyone on the fancy school-branded buses would point out at every third house, "Oh, there's my house, and there's yours, that one's John's," etc. At the time, I lived in another plenty nice if less expensive exclusive neighborhood and found the whole thing eye-roll worthy. In 10th grade my parents let me transfer to a local public art school where overall I was much happier. One day we were riding a rusty yellow city school bus on a field trip through that very same fancy old money neighborhood and 90 of the kids on that bus rushed to the windows, gasping and pointing at the houses. My God guys, look at that house, and that one, whoa these are houses, etc. The different 6 months and a new school make, it was wild. Really stuck with Maine my brain. Story 14 we wanted to try the new rail transit system. Our friend's driver dropped us off at one station, so we could get tickets and ride the train. When we got to the next station, we got off and proceeded to find our friend's driver, who was waiting there to pick us up and take us home. Story 15 I've had many, but a particularly memorable one was when a guy at work I'd been flirting with older than me. I was 19 and he was around 25, so in my naive mind it was plausible that he was set up despite the fact that we both worked shitty retail jobs. Told me he'd signed a lease on a new apartment. How many bedrooms? I asked conversationally. He laughed and said 5, it's a penthouse suite. Wow, I thought, he's doing pretty well for himself. A couple weeks later he brought me back to his new apartment, which was in fact a 300 square foot studio. At this point it occurred to me that Head thought I was making a joke when I asked how many bedrooms his new apartment had. Story 16 when I went to my husband's parents' house for the first time. After dinner the mom wheeled in a dishwasher and hooked it up to the kitchen faucet. I'd never seen nor heard of this type of dishwasher. Story 17 when I met my wife we were in high school. We were both involved in marching band and the band takes a trip out of state every 2 years. My senior year the trip was to Washington, D.C. Even though it was a school-sponsored trip, you still had to pay a fee to go. The fee was $1,200. That covered the whole trip as far as room and board, airfare, bus rentals, pretty much everything except if you wanted to buy personal stuff. You could make like 6 payments or something to make it more affordable for folks. I remember my mom just wrote me a $1,200 check like it was nothing. When talking to my wife she wasn't even my girlfriend at the time. Just a cute girl with a big booty. She was saying she didn't even know if she could go because $1,200 is a lot of money. I was like, just have your parents write a check, easy. She looked and was like, yeah my parents don't just have $1,200 to drop like that. Turns out a lot of other parents didn't either. When the paid up list came up only me and maybe 2 other kids were fully paid up by the time the first payment was due. There's other things, but that's one that sticks in my brain. I had no idea this girl I was talking to was gonna be my wife, which is cool too. I married me that cute girl with a big booty, and we're poor together. Story 18 Dad was an engineer, so professional wealth, but not like gaff wealth. Probably hearing about a kid whose family had to give his dog away due to the cost in elementary school. Giving away our dog wasn't on the radar or even on the table, but it was only out of the question because my parents had the money for it to be out of the question. Story 19 I wasn't wealthy compared to national averages, but my parents made $100K in the 90s and I lived in a small and economically disadvantaged town, so I was definitely part of the one. In middle school my friend lived in a trailer. I had stayed the night at her house and while I was surprised by the inconvenience of how small it was, that actually wasn't a wake-up call because I had been in trailers before. When she finally came over to my typical 90s built home 2-story, 3BR, she said you can't even see the whole house all at once. It just keeps going. I had never seen my life through someone else's eyes before, and it definitely made me more grateful. Story 20 probably told this story here before. Grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. During summer break when I was maybe 10 to 11, I was watching Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Episode finished and I ran downstairs to my dad, who was on his knees pulling weeds out of the garden and said, "Dad, you should become a millionaire so we can have a butler like in Fresh Prince." He just looked at me and said, "Gus Frabba, I am a millionaire," and went back to weeding. Story 21 realizing how lucky I was for my parents to pay for my car to get me a good reliable car that I will have for years to come and taking care of the maintenance for it. Story 22 my oldest brother was raised by grandparents in another country. I remember when he moved to the States after turning 18, he was in awe of seeing a garage door automatically open. That's when I realized we grew up way different than him. Sad really. But man, he sure did rise and become the most successful of all his siblings. Story 23 we did an exchange program to Berlin. I had to share my room with 2 of my classmates. It was totally normal to them. That really opened my eyes that even if you're not America type of rich you're still rich on a global level. Story 24 I grew up really poor and reading these comments makes me sad. I have a lot to be thankful for, but I hate how the quality and trajectory of our lives is generally predetermined based on the type of parents we have. Story 25 when I was in high school, I had to volunteer 20 hours or something of community service for National Honor Society. I always loved kids so I ended up volunteering at this women and children's shelter my mom always donated our clothes to. I basically just played with the babies and toddlers. A staff member was always there on Sunday, while parents were at the church service that I guess was part of the requirement to stay at the shelter. I can't remember exactly, but one Sunday, a mom came to pick up her baby and she was super agitated. She just started screaming at the kid and taking out a lot of frustration on him verbally. I don't remember exactly what she said, but she screamed a bunch of profanities at the child. It was jarring because I don't think I'd ever seen anyone act that way, and certainly never directed at a toddler. I remember realizing that I hadn't even learned those words until I was like 10 years old, and my parents had never, ever talked to me that way. It was this profound moment for me, and the first time I remember wondering how differently my life might have turned out if I'd been raised any differently than I had, which was in a super loving and nurturing household with two kind and gentle parents. This isn't to say that the mom who screamed at her kid wasn't a loving or kind parent. Maybe she was. And I saw her on a bad day. I like to hope so. It was just eye-opening for me that some kids go through all that and worse for their entire childhoods, and I never had to endure a second of mistreatment. It made me realize how set up I was to succeed by forces beyond of my control, which is maybe the definition of privilege. Story 26. I forgot to take my laundry downstairs one week, but I still had plenty of clothes to get through a second week, and a couple of people asked if I'd ruined my old clothes beyond rewear that I got new stuff. It was then that I realized those people wore the same stuff every single week in different orders. Story 27. I get wake-up calls every day. I swear I was always told we were struggling, but I always had new clothes and shoes for school, we always had food, I went to uni with no real spending money, but I still went to uni. Every year I get a glimpse of something else. Last year we were struggling financially. I was working overtime, living week to week, scared about how we were going to pay our mortgage, my rent on my office, keep the kids in their activities, get medicine for the dog, but we still had all of those things, and we kept all of those things, and I have never been more grateful than I was last year. It was the weirdest loop of worrying and being thankful, absolute mindfuck. Story 28. My wake-up call came when I dated my first partner. They only had Hot Pockets to eat for dinner, and I realized I never had so little to eat for a dinner meal. They also lived on the rougher side of town, so it was a bit sketchy at night. My second partner after that had it worse. His family was struggling with bills and food insecurity. It sucked to see him worried about what I would think of his family. He wouldn't invite me over because he was afraid of power cutting out. He also worried about them not having enough food to also feed me. His parents seemed absolutely lovely, just going through a rough time. Story 29. In college, I went on a road trip with friends and one asked how much money he should put in the gas tank. I told him to fill it up, kept asking okay, but how much should I pay? And I kept saying fill it up. Turns out he had only ever put 10 to 15 at a time, and it had never occurred to me that some people never filled their gas tanks to the top. Story 30. Not me but my friend, went to his house and he had a pool inside his house next to the living room separated by a large glass wall, and of course it was warm. I was like, yeah, dude, you're like really rich. Story 31. My father cut me off his Amex, and I honestly never knew only filling up my car on a monthly basis is already cutting a big share out of my net income. You only realize what you have when you lose it. Story 32. I didn't grow up wealthy, more like comfortable. I heard stories about how kids only got to eat meals at school or skipped meals at home because there wasn't a lot. I wasn't wealthy, but I still had some privileges. Never had to skip a meal or portion control to have food for later. Story 33. Not me but my cousin. I lived in an apartment with 2 windows without central air, so in the summer it was really humid and hot inside night day. She asked me why I couldn't just turn the air on because she's really hot and can't sleep. Jirler'll go get a cold wash rag and go to bed. Story 34. I went to Africa to do volunteer work for a summer long, and seeing how kids live there made me realize where you get born makes a huge difference, and all Americans already are wealthy at that point. Story 35. Living as an American kid in Kyrgyzstan. My family wouldn't have been wealthy to any other American, but I grew up feeling very, very rich. At recess my school had a soccer ball to play with. Through the chicken wire fence, I could see all the other kids kicking a clump of leaves tied with string. Story 36. Was staying the summer at my grandmother's house. I was probably 10-11-ish and hanging out with her best friend's granddaughter who was my age. She asked me my dream car and I said the name of a supercar, then I asked her back and she said a Range Rover. I told her that she should pick a less boring car and called it a mom car, and she asked me to clarify what I meant. So I told her that everyone at my school's moms drove one, so I thought it was boring. Her eyes widened and she was like, where do you go to school? I had no idea before that conversation that we weren't middle class. Story 37. I don't think I ever really had a wake-up call moment. I knew from a young age my dad had done well for himself. So I'd have to say my parents, and traveling back to Europe. My parents lived well, but well below their means. My dad to the day he died, always considered himself a simple Balkan peasant. Traveling to their home country every year also let me see a large disparity in how people live, which I think made a huge difference in my life, and I realized at a very young age that I was privileged. Story 38. I had a fairly idyllic, TV show childhood, private schools, overnight summer camp, played every sport, did every activity, etc. I actually thought we were average and fairly middle class. We didn't do big vacations, usually just long holiday weekends to our golf house a couple of hours outside of the city, and everyone around me was roughly on the same level. I went skiing every weekend in the winter, but so did everyone else. We lived in a modest-seeming townhouse in the city. My parents both worked and we didn't belong to a country club. In comparison, Several of my cousins went on long vacations and lived in mansions in historic suburbs. The only long vacation I'd ever been on was 2 weeks in Longboat Key, which no one had ever heard of. My 8th grade year, 2 separate teachers had full-blown meltdowns in class about how out of touch and privileged we were. I think that finally caused me to examine my surroundings and go, oh, maybe this is unusual. As an aside, I also later realized the reason we didn't take vacations was because my father was a commodities trader. Until he retired, he rarely took a day off unless he was seriously ill. My mother, the attorney, worked a lot as well. They're making up for that now. Story 39. They're really stupid really, but I have two. The first is the first time I threw something into a friend's drain. I think it was an apple core and his mom had to tell me that they threw them away. I proceeded to ask why they didn't use their garbage disposal, and yep, they didn't have one. Later in life it was solidified in my mind that there are a lot of homes that don't have one. The second was in the Middle East with the realization that not everyone, not only in the Middle East, obviously has water to bathe in or drink, and enough food. It's one thing to see the news or the sad charity commercials, but quite another to have those scenes play out in real life. In order to get involved, anyway, yeah, first world problems I guess. Story 40. Never needed a wake-up call. My parents did a good job teaching my sister and I the value of money, and took the time to explain life was only so easy because of the wealth, and made us get jobs at 14 to pay for things like our car insurance, phone plans, and anything we wanted, while also letting us struggle to earn money and sometimes fail without bailing us out. Story 41. Grew up middle class but in a very poor area. People thought we were rich because my parents each had their own car and we lived in a brick house rather than a trailer or shack. Story 42. Well, the joke is on me because I'm broke now, but I remember my mom driving us into the city and looking at the row houses as we went by and thinking that the people who owned them just had bad taste. Story 43. When my sister and my dad got into a big fight and my dad responded to my sister's comments about having nothing, decided to take her to a major city 12 hours away and show her people truly with nothing. Story 44. I come from middle class in America, but my grandma was talking about how she had a maid in Bolivia. I brought up how privileged that was and she goes, we weren't privileged, everybody had maids. I asked if the maids had maids and she couldn't answer. Oh. Story 45. I didn't think I grew up in a wealthy family, but when I started high school I was part of a group of girls who became close friends with me. Apparently, they thought it was very weird that I knew things that I considered cultural knowledge, like the history of some important building in the city or the fact that I actually knew about art and went to museums quite often. All this because my parents made me go to museums and theaters my whole life growing up. Apparently that's not a normal thing for normal parents to do with their kids, and asking your parents if they can take you to the ballet is not something a teenager would normally ask. Story 46. I grew up wealthy, not with money, but with great parents. I used to go over my friends' houses and come home appreciating my parents even more. Yes, they were annoying, but I always knew they cared. One friend had an abusive, violent dad. I was always afraid of his temper. One friend had a mom who yelled all the time at all the kids. I can see now that Shed had too many kids too quickly and was overwhelmed with the responsibility. One friend had a mom who wouldn't let us into the living room. It was the kind with plastic slipcovers everywhere. That always seemed weird to me. One friend had a dad who was always drunk and a little handsy. One friend just didn't have a dad. He had died when she was 6. One friend didn't have a dad either. Had run off with his secretary. A major scandal in town. One friend had a mom who was super religious, and we had to watch our mouths over there. I got in trouble once for saying the awful swear word, but... Story 47. Not so much wealth as a very big house. A few school friends came over and we played hide and seek in first grade, and word spread quickly that my house was the best hide and seek house known to man. It was a big house. We had a family of 10, so it felt normal, but not everyone had like 600 to 800 square feet. My dad grew up poor and was self-made and bought a house for like $50,000 in the late 60s, and that was a lot of money then, but not an obscene amount. House sells for like $2 million now. Times have changed. He sold it before the big run-up. Story 48. Me and some coworkers started talking about high school, and somehow I ended up mentioning my senior trip. I mentioned that my senior class went to Spain. There was silence, then someone PFFD'd and jokingly said my school went to Six Flags. Someone else said they couldn't even remember their senior trip, and another said the local beach. It hit me fast that yummy parents pulling $6,000 out of their asses for a tour of Spain for my senior trip, with almost my entire class, probably wasn't normal. That was the first time I realized I had a privileged background. For reference, I'm a black woman, and I think I get caught up in looking at the negative aspects of privilege in the black community that I didn't even clock that I as an individual am. Story 49. My family immigrated to the US with 3 pieces of luggage, pretty much just clothes. For years, my parents worked min-wage jobs because they weren't fluent in English. Despite both having master's degrees in high-demand fields, I was the kid in elementary school wearing someone's hand-me-downs and getting free lunch. Then my parents learned English well enough to transition into careers that matches their education and experience. That was about 35 years ago. They aren't rich, but they're definitely doing better than a good portion of the country. I didn't have a wake-up call per se, but over the years I did see improvements. At first little by little, then considerable things like outright owning 2 houses in a HCL and building a cabin. Okay, it's a 3,600 square foot cabin, in a touristy ski town. I guess at some point, I'd say about 10 to 15 years ago, I started actually noticing and realizing how hard my parents worked for everything. I guess that was my wake-up call. Story 50. Upper middle class. It wasn't any aha moment, but growing up I thought poor people lived in apartments or multifamily units. When I moved to a different state as an adult, I moved to a fairly impoverished area and dated someone that grew up very poor. It was a very awakening and humbling experience to learn what poverty actually was. Now I live in poverty being disabled, but am still extremely privileged in the poverty I live in. Story 51. I'm from a third world country, so will be poor compared to people living in wealthier countries. One day my parents brought heaps of strawberries home and I gave some to a homeless guy. Later I saw him eating them with his 2 daughters. I feel sad seeing how they can't normally afford such fruits. I feel like even the people who live on food stamps in wealthier countries are way more privileged than these poor kids living in a third world countries. Story 52. My university had an event with all the student organizations. I went up to one of the tables to see what it was about, and a student was teaching how to cook scrambled eggs in a microwave. I instinctively asked, why would anybody do that? There's a stove top. Poor kid just stared at me with a straight face and said, unfortunately, some students only have access to microwaves. That stopped me right in my tracks and I realized that I was privileged, and should probably stop talking. Story 53. Didn't grow wealthy like maybe the question intends, but definitely on the upper end of middle class. I was always somewhat aware of the privilege, but in my 30s and looking like I'm not going to be able to provide those same things for my family makes me even more keenly aware. Don't get me wrong, I work hard and we are still middle class and comfortable, but I can't imagine I'll be raising my kids in a massive house and taking week-long vacations and hosting parties. Shits. Unexpected baby 2 meant we had to sell our house after we lost a second income. Maybe it's more a sign of the economy that a low-end 6-figure salary isn't enough where I live. Story 54. Middle school. I visited the house of one of my classmates. Shock, can't even describe it. Her house is the size of my bedroom. It's made of tarps, dried grass, bamboo, and packed dirt. The toilet is outside, shared with 2 other houses. She lives with her parents and grandparents there. I want to cry for her, but I don't want to pity her. I like to think I've been kind to her for the 4 years we've known each other. I don't know how she is right now, but I hope she and her family is doing alright. Better. Story 55. We moved across the country from Florida to CA. I remember my parents buying a house within walking distance of my maternal grandmother. We lived under a letter carved into the side of the mountain. My first day of school, other kids asked where we lived. I only knew to tell them that the letter was directly under my house. The other kids gawked at my living arrangements. When I moved out at 18, I realized how privileged I grew up in comparison to colleagues, my significant other, and so on. Story 56. We weren't wealthy, but we were well off, and when I was about 10 I went with my parents to purchase a Hooked on Phonics set. We went looking back to a lower-income apartment complex. I vividly remember asking my parents why we were going to a hotel. They were very unimpressed with that statement, and told me not to repeat that in front of the seller. Story 57. In Tulum, Mexico around 8 p.m. at night, we took a wrong turn and ended in a poor neighborhood. We could hear all the laughter and sound of dining and live music playing, but the street we walked down was full of concrete houses with no windows or doors, just holes where those things go, and the families were sleeping outside in the courtyard because it was cooler outside than inside. Literally imagining going to sleep every night in the poorest conditions, while listening to wealthy people eating rich food and having a good time right next to you. Story 58. My parents were pretty conservative with buying things growing up. Didn't upgrade cars all the time, and we stayed in our, in hindsight, very nice family home, while many other families I knew would move into bigger and swankier houses. But the summer I went to college they told me they had bought a new house and we were moving out of our neighborhood into a huge house on the lake with a pool. I genuinely asked them how we could afford this because it didn't make sense. Then they essentially called me an idiot because we traveled internationally almost every year and I was going to a private. I had never realized things like those were quite expensive and my parents were doing things without taking up debt. We just lived under our means for many years and I had thought we were almost poor. Story 59. I was the new kid at a Catholic primary school out in the middle Australian burbs. Think Muriel's wedding. We had just moved there from overseas. It was the start of the school year, and we had to draw what we did over the summer and present it to the class. I drew the Eiffel Tower and a bicycle. I talked about going to Paris and jumping up and down on this weird metal plate the Points Road de Routes de France, and that I got a red BMX for Christmas. The look on the teacher's face was enough for me to realize that discretion is the better part of valor. I was 8. Story 60. I was the troubled child out of all my siblings and struggled through a lot of substance abuse for over a decade. I definitely paid for my sins, but not financially. My parents were helping cover my rent when I would lose jobs. They were covering my travel expenses when I eventually did lose housing and needed to fly back home. They bailed me out of jail multiple times. They paid for rehab and therapy, etc. Oh, and all of this was after they put me through a private 4-year college. It never clicked for me until a therapist called out my privilege once, noting that most people in those situations usually end up homeless or dead. Brought this up to my mother and she waved it off, saying it was never about the money. She was just happy I knew how to ask for help. Yeah, that's when I learned that safety nets are a thing, and no, not everyone has one. 6 years clean BTW, and hopefully won't need that net again anytime soon. Story 61. I have been flying around the world since I am 4 months old. When I was 16 my friend told me she'll fly for the first time in an airplane and I was shocked. I told my dad that I couldn't believe it took her 16 years to fly. Got a stern talk after. My dad is very humble despite it all. Story 62. I couldn't understand why people were so sensitive about bathroom use timings. Like, what's the matter if Hesh is taking too long? Just use one of the other bathrooms. There's 2 on this floor, 2 above and 1 below. Don't be a complainer and use another if you're really in a rush. Then I discovered people don't usually have multiple bathrooms. Or at least that many. Story 63. I was solid middle class. Never knew there was more. I thought we were rich. I was on scholarship to a school as an athlete. There were clues, but I didn't know enough to know. His folks stayed at the Ritz. His folks had multiple homes. His folks gave him unlimited money. His folks let him leave college during his 3rd year to travel Europe. When a helicopter showed up, I was speechless.